Hey, LinkedIn, and welcome to Business Unusual. This is a live show where we talk about the changing nature of work. I am Susie Jackson. I'm a news editor at LinkedIn, coming to you live today to talk about performance reviews in the time of coronavirus. Should companies even have them? To talk about that in a few minutes, we're going to be hearing from a great guest, Dr. Ella Washington. She's a management professor at Georgetown University. But before we bring Ella out, I want to look at some of the top news stories trending on LinkedIn today, August 4th. Thousands of after school programs might not be reopening. About 9 in 10 programs citing they don't have enough funding, according to a survey by the nonprofit group, the After School Alliance. 6 in 10 programs fear they may never reopen at all. And the workday is getting longer while in a pandemic, according to a working paper out from the National Bureau of Economic Research. The study finds the workday on average is 45 and a half minutes longer, has about 13% more meetings, and sees employees sending 1.4 more daily emails. A separate study from NordVPN points out employees are working odd hours as well, possibly due to home and childcare demands. For more stories like these, check out the LinkedIn news module to the right of your newsfeed if you're on a desktop or if you're on your mobile app. Click into the search box and you'll see those stories and more from the LinkedIn news team. For today's poll from the LinkedIn news team, we want to know your opinion on if working remotely due to coronavirus helped your team brainstorm more effectively. Tell us yes or no in the comments. Give us your thoughts on why you think that during the show today. We're going to check back on the results at the end of the program. And that brings us to today's main story, which is it's performance review season. For many companies, it's a really intense time to be evaluating employee progress and achievement since the way we do business has been drastically upended by coronavirus. Plans and forecasts pre COVID are mostly obsolete. What does that mean when it's time to measure progress? Talk to me, talk to each other. What are you as a manager doing to have these conversations with your employees? What are you as an employee hoping that your manager says to you, probably on the other side of a video conference for this year's review? To get some expertise on these questions, I want to welcome my guest, Dr. Ella Washington. She is a management professor at the University of Georgetown and the CEO of Elevate Solutions. Dr. Washington, thank you for being here today.
Hi, Susie. Thanks so much for having me today.
I want to start talking about the history of performance reviews. I know it's something that you've looked into. Where has performance management been and where are we right now?
Yeah, great question. So, performance management has had an evolution over the last decade, and it's really included a major shift from that annual performance review that's been standard since around the 1940s and towards more frequent feedback, opportunities to change course in the middle of a performance cycle, and more employee participation. In fact, a 2016 study by Burson said that 70% of companies said they were moving towards this model of a manager as a coach having more frequent check-ins than just one-time annual reviews. And so we've really seen this shift take hold in a big way over the past 5 to 10 years. And the reason for that shift is that the annual feedback that was standard was highly ineffective. Research has shown it can actually make performance worse about one third of the time. And so there was good reason for performance management to start to shift over recent years.
So it's good that we already saw a shift coming before coronavirus just wrecked everything. But what is COVID doing to it right now?
Yeah, so COVID is making performance even more uncertain. There's so many things that we're having to deal with during COVID-19 that we weren't having to deal with before. And so performance management in 2020 and honestly beyond has to account for these realities of uncontrolled work environments where everything from the ergonomics of your chair to doubling as homeschool teachers to overworking, as you just mentioned in the top news story for today, all of those things can impact employees' productivity. So I think of work-life balance as unfortunately a thing of the past. We have to start having explicit conversations during these times of what it means to have work-life integration instead of balance, because we're all juggling work and life right now and working right where we live. And so before were those outside responsibilities previously did not have an impact on our workday, they certainly do now and will for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and I want to say hello to some of the members joining us in the stream today to talk about this. The performance review season is upon us. We have Jewel from Delaware, Tony from Canada. Welcome to the show. Thank you for watching. Quentin is joining us from Virginia, Carmen from Hawaii, Vivek from India. We've got people all over the world today, and Alyssa from Dallas. Dr. Washington, we're talking about performance reviews. You just mentioned something, just a mundane detail, ergonomics. I mean, we're everything has changed about work,
Yeah.
including where we sit and where we do this work. I don't want to tell you the chair I'm sitting on right now. It's definitely not ergonomically correct. Given all that, all this disruption, should companies even have performance reviews right now?
Yeah, great question. I think absolutely yes. Companies do need performance reviews. They're important for to help companies navigate what metrics they should have in place, and especially during the harsh economic times that we're facing, there's a need more now than ever to continue to motivate employees. When done right, performance management actually does motivate employees. And contributes to their employee development. So, short answer, yes, they are needed, but they should look a bit different and they must take the current environment into account.
We have Rob in the stream saying he loves your comment about work life integration versus work life balance. He finds that really interesting. And you just mentioned that performance reviews should look different. Can you tell us how should that look right now from both the manager side and the employee side?
Absolutely. So, part of the reason that traditional reviews were actually so ineffective is that they tried to tackle too many things in one annual conversation. You might have a manager covering your whole year's performance, acknowledging your wins, giving you advice on where to improve, setting compensation, and charting your career development path. Even me just saying that, it's too much, right? It's too much for a 1 hour conversation that just happens once a year. So, performance review conversations first should be distinct from compensation discussions. They also should be distinct from bigger picture career development conversations, which is why they're needed on a more frequent basis. The more often we can have these feedback conversations, the more likely you're able to check in with your manager and focus on development aspects in these kind of pivotal annual or even better biannual conversations, as opposed to this is the only time you receive feedback from your manager.
Yeah, so you're talking about kind of a coaching relationship. It's not just this one-time check-in out of the blue where you haven't spoken about any of this. We've got some members in the stream echoing that they think that's a good idea too. Meenakshi says coaching is definitely a must-have, a managerial and leadership skill. It's more about work-life integration. Again, people are really responding to that. Thank you for that sentiment. It says work is no longer a place we go to. It's an activity we do as part of our lives. We're bringing our whole selves to work. I think we've heard that expression a lot pre-coronavirus, but I think that's a really great point that your whole self is at work all the time because you are in your home. You can't escape it. And since you can't escape these things, I'm really curious. How do you think managers should consider the impact of COVID-19 on workers' ability to perform?
Yeah, they certainly should be considering that. I think in today's world and facing our current realities, part of good management is to ask your team members questions about how the pandemic, how social justice movements, how a myriad of things that are happening outside of work are impacting their work. And I said outside of work because, as you know, our viewers are commenting, there is no inside or outside of work. It all is happening within our homes. So I think that good managers should create space not only to discuss the impact of things like the pandemic are affecting our business, but also how it's affecting the employee individually. I mean, if we look at the stats, we already know that performance management will shift and it can exacerbate disparities we already saw for racial minorities and for women in the workplace. So, for example, early in COVID-19, there was research that came out that academics in productivity had already gone down, specifically for women professors, as noted by them submitting fewer journal submissions. That's a big deal for performance management if you're measured by, for example, in academia, the number of articles you submit. Additionally, as we think about COVID-19's disparate impact on people of color who's been disproportionately impacted by the virus, the psychological impact of you physically having COVID-19 and getting through that, or even worse, losing a loved one to the virus, that can't be underestimated, especially given that the pandemic, unfortunately, is still raging and we don't have a near-term solution. And so all of these things should be top of mind for managers as they enter performance conversations. For lack of a better term, there is not business as usual. It's certainly business unusual today, and performance conversations should reflect that.
I think it's an interesting point you bring up about COVID-19 is still raging. What if you are sick? What if someone in your household is sick or is passed on because of coronavirus? We talk a lot about working parents. I'm one myself that's an issue that's top of mind for many, but maybe more insidious sometimes is that you're really dealing with the illness on the front line of your workplace in your household as well. I have a question from Patrick in the stream. He says, if reviews are done, should they be done in both directions? What do you think about that? Employees usually ready to come in and know that they'll be evaluated. Is this an opportunity for them to give feedback to their manager as well about perhaps their unique needs in this situation?
Absolutely. Performance reviews should be structured, first of all. So it shouldn't be a surprise for either party what will be discussed during that review conversation. For example, a best practice is that a manager should send the topics they'd like to discuss ahead of time and invite the employee to add to the agenda so the conversation feels like a two-way dialogue. So it's certainly one should not be a surprise and it should be a two-way dialogue. Secondly, I'd say that performance management should always be developmental. It is possible to have honest and transparent feedback conversations while also making them developmental. And part of connecting with those developmental goals are checking in with employees on how they're making progress on the goals that they set. And for goals to be meaningful, we know that both parties should have a hand in creating the goals. And so, to answer the question, it really should be two-way communication during this annual review the year in terms of how you're setting goals and how you plan to achieve them.
That's great. So some encouragement there that it's okay to use this as an opportunity to have that conversation a little bit more two-way with your manager than maybe you would have done in the past.
Right.
We have Jennifer in the stream weighing in, just acknowledging the crisis and impact to the organization is really important in these conversations. She says flexibility is the name of the performance game. As the performance game is being flexible and is changing throughout this crisis, I'm curious, Dr. Washington, what you think that this shift can mean for how we tailor future performance reviews, given we don't really know how long this is going to last.
Yeah, well, I mean, we also have to consider that even before COVID-19, performance reviews were not something that employees looked forward to. A Gallup study even found that only 14% of employees strongly agree their performance reviewed inspired them to improve. And again, this is pre-COVID-19. So if we're really trying to engage our workforce and maximize productivity and maximize, what we get out of our workforce, the reviews have to be motivating. And so, they have to be timely. And I think more now than ever, they should be more frequent because things are changing so frequently. And managers really have to understand the current dynamics with an employee. So, yes, they might be dealing with the illness themselves or a close family member, or maybe they've had a sudden shift in their childcare availability. Those things, again, are changing really quickly. And so the timely feedback is important in order for this conversation to continue to evolve and for managers to be evaluating performance in a way that's both meaningful and connected with the employee's lived experience.
Yeah, I think that's probably true that most people aren't looking forward to these conversations, even in the best of times. So it's good to keep that in mind that you're starting from that place and then adding all this heavy stuff on top of it. If you are joining us now, this is Business Unusual. We are having a conversation with Dr. Ella Washington today. She's a management professor at Georgetown University, and we're talking performance reviews. For many of us, it's performance review season, mid-year review time. Ella says it's a time that you should still be having these reviews, even if it's difficult. And I'm curious, Dr. Washington. Oh, you know what? Let me get to our poll real quick, actually, too. And I should ask you this. Do you think working remotely during coronavirus has helped your team to brainstorm more effectively? Dr. Washington, tell me what your thoughts, and then we're going to flash the graphic for everyone as well.
I would say absolutely. So my team at Georgetown has certainly had to be creative, as many schools have had to recently shift to 100% virtual, just as we were planning to go back in person or a hybrid model. And so not only have we had to brainstorm more effectively, we've had to do it more quickly and in ways that we're not used to. We're used to being in person and enjoying each other in the business school, but we've had to be more creative even about how and when we brainstorm. So I'd say absolutely for my team.
All right, so that's a yes for you. I think for me, I feel like it's a no. I don't feel like I'm as good kind of off the cuff in a meeting as I am if I'm in person with people. But I think that brings us back to a question I want to talk about is that there's kind of more stress now involved when you're not with your colleagues. And we're talking about performance reviews. So how can an individual think about their own personal growth and progress given that stress, given that extra strain? We've heard a lot about grace and being empathetic. And I think those are scary words when you talk about a performance review, which feels like a very serious thing. You said earlier, no one really looks forward to them. So how should you balance that? Be easier on yourself, but it's review time and it's really serious. What would you tell people?
Yeah, so I would echo the sentiment of giving yourself grace because this is a hard time. And COVID-19 is requiring all of us to demonstrate our ability to thrive in the midst of uncertainty. We're all working remotely, and organizations in themselves have this added layer of ambiguity of what's going to happen. And part of that is rethinking performance management. So, for that employee that's thinking about their own development, I think it's actually a perfect time, though, to hone in on your strengths. And so we each have these unique strengths that we can lean on during these times. And managers and employees should be working together to think creatively about how they can leverage the strengths that employees already have. And maybe we're demonstrating pre COVID, but now can demonstrate in a new way. So, for example, if you're someone who is really strong in client relationships face to face, how can you brainstorm with your manager how to continue to maintain and even increase those client relationships in a virtual environment and finding new ways even to engage with clients? And so, I think employees should have very explicit conversations with their managers on the things that they feel like they're really strong at, and also the things that they feel like that are within their control. I think there's so much uncertainty, but we do have these critical things that are within our control, such as our ability to communicate effectively. But there's also so much that's without our control. And so part of that explicit conversation is identifying those things within the employee's control and how they're maximizing those things, even with all of the uncertainty of the things that are without their control.
And speaking of explicit conversations, we've got a couple of questions in the stream about salary, about pay cuts, about promotions. How do you have those kind of specific conversations? Erica says this hasn't just been a health crisis, the impact has been economic. Some team members are facing salary cuts, yet still are expected to perform. Jatchinder says some companies have taken COVID as an opportunity to reduce performance pay. In the medium term, how do you think that will affect employees and companies? And what if you are one of these employees who is coming up on a promotion or a raise, or you're on track for that before all this happened? How should employees and companies be thinking about increases and bonuses and rewards?
Yeah, lots of good stuff there. So, first, I think employers have to acknowledge that it is tough economically. And when you cut employees' pay 25%, 20%, or even 5%, it has an impact. And I don't think employers are well served to act like things are business as usual and these cuts don't have an impact not only on employees' economic standing, but also their morale, right? We go to work and we want to be paid, we want to be compensated for our value. We also want to get those merit increases. For many employees, it helps in terms of helping them to stay motivated. In terms of when you're thinking about that promotion that maybe you were promised for this year and now it's looking like it may not happen, I'd say just as I advocate for employees to give themselves grace, I think we also do have to extend some grace to our leaders. We have to remember that even though there are leaders, they've never experienced a global pandemic like this that we're seeing now. And so they need a little bit of grace as we're all trying to figure this out together. But with that said, I don't think that means you should give up on your goals. You shouldn't give up on that promotion or that raise. So even if the raise can't come right now, how can you be proactive about talking to your manager about your continued desires for development? How can you keep showing that you're engaged and you look forward to revisiting those conversations maybe in a few months when things shift? I think it's personally okay to ask questions that your manager maybe hasn't thought about. Again, we're all figuring this out together. And so you might be able to come up with ideas to aid the conversation that maybe they haven't considered. So, for example, can you ask for the formal promotion review in 3 months from now instead of at the regular time because things have shifted? Or maybe is it a possibility to get that bump in pay that you're promised 3 months from now and get the bump in title now, right? And so I think it's okay for us to be creative and to have these conversations, these unconventional conversations, since we are in such an unconventional time.
And it's a great point to mirror the unconventionality of this. We're going into this review season and nothing's the same, so the conversations aren't going to be the same too. I think that's great advice about encouraging people to be creative. Maybe you're not going to get exactly what you want exactly when you wanted it, but that
Right.
doesn't mean that you shouldn't ask, with some grace, like you said, to extend that to your corporation as well. If you're lucky enough to still have that job, maybe the question of what you want and when you want it is different because you might not have gotten it if you might not have a job if you've gotten exactly what you were planning on. We've got Linda in the stream with kind of a bold statement. We love to see some good opinions on Business Unusual coming through. She says performance reviews are a waste of time and create stress. If an employee wasn't doing a good job at any time, the employee would already be in discussions with their manager to resolve those issues. But she does say she agrees that having ongoing conversations and open communications is important. So, what do you say to that, Dr. Washington? Can you have the ongoing conversation in lieu of the formal annual review?
I think we have seen companies that have gotten rid of the performance annual review altogether. Like Adobe is a company that, a few years ago was really out in the forefront as innovators of getting rid of their annual reviews. GE is another company that's really been experimenting with this, with not only getting rid of the annual review, but trying new kind of web-based systems for more frequent and timely feedback. I would also mention, though, this notion of them not being effective and them causing stress is largely because most managers haven't been trained to evaluate performance, to give feedback, or to charter developmental plans. And so we know that when organizations replace the annual review with more frequent feedback, but don't also marry that with sufficient training, they actually discover that their managers don't know how to talk to employees, aren't able to have effective conversations at all. And so I think we look at companies like Adobe that have tried more tactical ways of training managers, such as they literally have them role playing what a positive manager employee check-in should look like. And this takes time and practice. In my role as professor, I try to get my students in my MBA and my undergraduate classes to have these types of training conversations, because it takes time to really learn how to give developmental feedback. So, while I agree that the systems are not perfect, and there's always room for improvement, I think when done right, they can, not cause that stress that the viewer is talking about.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that, Dr. Washington? Because Carmen here in the stream is saying, what do you do if you have a people leader who is just checking a box of performance review and isn't really following the corporate structure to be engaging, insightful, and productive? So, if you were Carmen, if you have to talk to someone who you can see isn't really skilled in this, how do you help them along to then better serve their employees and productivity overall?
Yeah, so I think you have to advocate for yourself as an employee. I think part of development is also thinking about what you need from your employer, what you need from your direct manager. And so I think it's having that conversation, is that I need more frequent feedback. I need more direct information about how I'm doing and how this tracks along, the success of our team. And so if your manager is not giving you something, I think it's totally okay to ask for that. And also to think about getting some peer feedback. And so, again, taking some of this onus on yourself for your own development is, how can you partner with some of your peers that maybe are strong in areas that you aren't, to get that feedback, to get additional coaching. So while it is the job of a manager, like I said, we know that all managers aren't equipped in this area. And I would hope that the organization is providing some structures to support development of that strength, but that's not always the case, unfortunately.
And we have folks answering this in the stream as well. Brandon is in response to Carmen as well, saying give feedback that is in line with with effective feedback, and give examples. So give a lot of examples as well. So Ella, I think it's great that you're saying that echoing what you said earlier, that you can ask for more, you can try to guide that, talk about explicitly about what your needs are as well. Dolores in the stream agrees with your statement that many managers have not been trained properly in how to give timely feedback and performance reviews. Considering not every manager is coming and starting from the same place of really knowing how to connect, about how to listen, how to gauge performance, especially now. What about these managers trying to evaluate employees who are living and working in very different circumstances? We've mentioned working parents. We've mentioned people dealing with COVID in their household. We've mentioned Black and Brown people under duress right now. There's people living completely alone as well. How do those considerations factor in to the end result of how well the employee is performing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they do have to factor in, but I do want to circle back to just that previous comment for a second, if you don't mind, Susie. In terms of employees wanting more feedback, so we know that 89% of employees say they want more formal performance conversations monthly or even more frequently, but also that 25% of employees say they don't know how to request feedback. And this is a information that came out of a reflective benchmark study just this year. And so there's this gap on the management side, but I also would challenge that there's a gap on the employee side of knowing how to request feedback and being comfortable with that. And so I think we have to try to close the gap on both ends. Now, back to your latter question around, how we should think about the impact of COVID-19 on performance reviews. I think we have to be really aware that performance reviews inherently are biased because we are biased as individuals. And so we have to work really hard on a regular basis to overcome the shortcuts that our brain makes to make things easier to categorize, everyday information. So, for example, when reviewing an employee's performance, managers tend to focus on the most recent time period instead of the total time period that they're reviewing. And so, for example, if someone recently closed a really big deal or they were not prepared for a presentation, either one of those things could show up more saliently in the review than they really should. And we think of that as recency bias. So things like that are already a challenge in regular performance management conversations, I think are exacerbated because we have so much of a cognitive load right now. We're all juggling a million things. We're all trying to figure our way through this pandemic. And so we have to be even more vigilant to try to check our biases that show up in decision making and frequently in performance management.
That's great advice for any performance review season to check your biases, but especially now in that recency bias as well, with everything being so crazy with coronavirus upending business. Dr. Washington, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing this wisdom. I think the stream was really loving it. I think you helped a lot of people think better about how to go into their reviews and better represent themselves in this crazy time. Thank you for joining us.
Excellent. Thank you, Susie, for having me. It's so much fun to be here.
That was Dr. Ella Washington. She is a management professor at the University of Georgetown and the CEO of Elevate Solutions. I want to check back in on our poll results. We wanted to know, has working remotely due to coronavirus helped your team brainstorm more effectively? We saw yeses from Alexandra, Quentin, Turquoise, Jordan, Natalie, Mary. We saw no's from Daniel, Phil, Kay, Chris, Fred, Jeff. Thank you for voting today. My vote was no. I don't feel like I'm brainstorming more effectively since coronavirus. I'm looking forward to some in-person brainstorming at some point in the future. This has been Business Unusual. We are a live show from the LinkedIn news page every day at noon Eastern. Please join us back here tomorrow when my colleague Caroline Fairchild will cover the results of a LinkedIn survey on the sentiments people have about returning to work, especially with working parents. She'll be talking with Rebecca Minkoff and ABC's Rebecca Jarvis to discuss those challenges and solutions. We hope to see you back here then, and thank you so much for joining us today.